Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey.
Perhaps the real mystery of the Shroud of Turin, regardless of whether it is authentic or forged, lies in its profound allure through the generations and across centuries, calling to something deep within us. Author and journalist Mark Orwell. Welcome back, everybody, to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, your host for this podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Before we get going today, I want to send out a huge thank you to Judy, one of our Alexandria-level patrons, on patreon.com for suggesting this episode. I always enjoy getting episode suggestions and ideas from all of you, so please keep them coming. Some of the best episodes of this show started with a listener saying, "Hey, what about this?" This is definitely one of those episodes. So today, at Judy's suggestion, we are looking at the Shroud of Turin, and the claim attached to this cloth is about as big as a claim can get. The claim is that this piece of linen is the actual burial shroud that was wrapped around Jesus of Nazareth after the crucifixion. If that claim is true, this would be the single most important physical object in the history of Christianity, and it isn't going too far to say one of the most important physical objects in the world. Here is what I'm going to try not to do today. We're not going to prove the shroud is authentic. We're not going to prove that it's a forgery either. And frankly, I can't do either of those things, and I'm suspicious of anyone who says they can, in a space of one podcast episode, do that. What we are going to do is ask a different question, the kind of question I always ask, and you do as well. What can actually be known about this object, and where does certainty break down? The thread, if you will, that's going to go through this episode is an idea called chain of custody. Where has this particular cloth been? Who held it? When did they hold it? And how do we know? At what point do documented links give way to reconstruction, guesswork, and hope? Keep that phrase in the back of your pocket, chain of custody, or keep it on the back burner, because everything today hangs on it. So what are we looking at here? The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth roughly 14 feet long and a little over 3.5 feet wide. For our metric fans, you get it. You get the gist. We don't have to do all the conversions. It's a big cloth, a cloth big enough to fit an adult male, completely wrapped. It has been kept in Turin in northern Italy since the late 1500s. On the cloth are two faint images, the front and the back of a man laid out head to head as if the body had been placed on one half the cloth and the other half folded up and over the top. The man in the image appears to bear wounds of crucifixion. There are marks that look like blood at the wrists and the feet and the side and around the head, where a crown of thorns was placed on top or would have sat. I'm not going to catalog every claimed anatomical detail here because people have written entire books doing exactly that, entire 6-hour documentaries arguing over every mark and every fiber. For our purposes, the broad, big idea is enough. The image shows an apparently crucified man. Most of its documentary history, that image was very faint. Visitors described a dim, brownish figure that you really had to work to see. Then in 1898, everything changed. An Italian photographer named Secondo Pia took the first official photograph of the shroud, and when he developed his glass plates or whatever they did back then, in the darkroom, the negative did something nobody expected. The figure on the photographic plate looked like an actual image. The faint marks resolved into a strikingly lifelike face with depth and detail that nobody had ever seen on the cloth itself. In a way, the shroud itself behaved like the photographic negative. Pio was reportedly so shaken here, he nearly dropped the plate, and I heard somewhere that he even exclaimed, "Oh my God." So, before we go any further, I want to separate three questions that almost get collapsed into one. Question 1, how was the image formed? Question 2, when was the cloth produced? And then question 3, who does the image depict? These are three distinct questions, and answering one does not automatically answer all the others. A cloth could be ancient and still not be the burial cloth of Jesus. An image could be unexplained and still be medieval. An explanation for how the image was formed would still not tell you whose image it is. So keep those three questions separate in your mind, because a whole lot of people who argue about the shroud, they try to nest all those answers together like one of those Russian nesting dolls, but they really need to be broken apart independently. Now let's talk about the science, and I'm going to keep this short on purpose. I'm doing that not because the science doesn't matter, but because the scientific debate is enormous and it's technical, and it's really not the main subject of today's episode. So point 1, in 1988, 3 laboratories in Oxford, Zurich, and Tucson, Arizona, performed radiocarbon dating on samples cut from the shroud. All 3 labs dated the linen to somewhere between roughly 1260 and 390 AD. That result is the strongest scientific evidence for a medieval origin of the cloth. Now here's an important caveat. The labs dated the material they were given, and every sample came from one small corner of the cloth. Questions have been raised ever since about whether that corner represented the entire cloth, including questions about later repairs in that area that would definitely occurred in the Middle Ages. The point stands that the strongest dating evidence points to medieval, and the strongest objection to it is about where the samples came from. I actually remember when this conclusion came out. I was a kid and I talked to my uncle about it, and I remember him being very convinced by that radiocarbon dating. I don't know why that conversation always stuck with me, but I think it's very interesting. Now, point 2, beyond the dating, there's a whole world of surface evidence, pollen grains, dust, DNA, traces of biological material. That evidence is genuinely difficult to interpret for one simple reason. The cloth has been displayed, folded, unfolded, kissed, handled, repaired, burned, doused with water, and hauled around Europe for at least 6.5 centuries. Anything sitting on the surface of that shroud could have arrived at almost any point in its long history. And then point 3, even if every scientific question broke in favor of authenticity, science cannot identify the man in the image and who is depicted. A securely dated cloth from the 1st century would still not by itself prove that it was wrapped around Jesus of Nazareth rather than somebody else who was crucified in that area and era. Those questions and the way to answer them have a name, and it's our big idea for today. It's chain of custody in the legal sense. In a courtroom, chain of custody means the documented trail of a piece of evidence. Who collected it? Who stored it? Who touched it? Every step from the crime scene to the witness stand. If that trail is broken, the evidence can get challenged, no matter how impressive it looks under the microscope. Archaeologists and historians have their own version of the same concept, and they call it provenance. An artifact dug up in a documented excavation with photographs, field notes, and a recorded find spot can tell you an enormous amount. The exact same artifact bought on an antiquities market, but somewhere between legit and shady, with no record of where it came from, becomes questionable at the least, and it's definitely a question mark of some sort. It might be genuine. You really don't know. You just can't demonstrate it in the same way, and no amount of admiration of the object or logical argumentation can fix that. We've talked about this many times before about mysterious gospels and artifacts of all type throughout this entire podcast. Scientists examining the shroud are not examining an object preserved under controlled conditions since the 1st century. They are examining a cloth that has accumulated a history, and every sample ever taken from the shroud carries that history with it. That doesn't make scientific investigation worthless, but it means no conclusion can be stronger than the chain of evidence, the provenance behind it. Here's the thing, though. It's not only the samples taken from the shroud that have a disputed chain of custody, the cloth itself does too. Where can this particular piece of linen be securely located? And how far back can the documentary evidence carry that knowledge? A ground rule before we start. A broken chain of custody does not prove a forgery. It limits certainty, and those are different things. The documented history of the Shroud of Turin begins in a small village of Liray in Champagne, France. A knight named Geoffroy de Charnay built a collegiate church in Liray, and around the middle of the 1300s, the cloth we now call the Shroud of Turin went on display in the church, and that is where that paper trail we're talking about began.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Hey listeners, it's Kelly from Life Audio. We know life gets busy, and sometimes it's easy for your faith to get pushed to the side. That's why we created The Good Word, a free weekly newsletter designed to give you a moment to slow down, be encouraged, and reconnect with what matters most, God's Word. Inside, you'll find devotionals, guided prayers, podcast recommendations, and other faith-filled content we think you'll love. No ads, no clutter. Just good content to help you stay rooted in God's Word throughout your week. Sign up for The Good Word today at lifeaudio.com/The Good Word. That's lifeaudio.com/The Good Word.
Now, that display did not go unchallenged back in the day, and the challenge came from inside of the church. The Bishop of Troyes, in whose diocese Liray sat, objected. According to the record we have, Bishop Henri de Poitiers investigated the exhibitions in the 1350s, and he shut them down. Within a generation or so of this cloth appearing in the historical record, the local bishop was alleging on paper to the Pope that this was a manufactured image. From there, the chain of custody gets solid. In 1453, Geoffroy's granddaughter, Margaret de Charnay, or Charny, I'm not sure, Charny, it doesn't really matter too much, handed the cloth over to the House of Savoy. the ducal family that would much later become the royal house of the unified Italy. The Savoys kept the shroud in their chapel in Chambéry, and in 1532, a fire tore through that whole chapel. The silver reliquary holding the folded cloth got so hot that the molten metal dripped down through the folded layers of the linen of the shroud, which why the shroud today carries that weird pattern of repeated scorch marks and patches running down the side of the figure. Nuns repaired the damage 2 years later, and those patches stayed on the cloth for nearly 500 years. In 1578, the Savoys moved the shroud to their new capital of Turin, where it is kept to this very day. From the later Middle Ages forward, the chain of prominence is comparatively well documented. Liray, the Chanit family, the Savoys, Chambéry, fire, Turin. From the late 1350s to today, we have chain of custody a lawyer could live with. Before Liray, we have nothing secure that attaches this particular object to the first century AD. Everything earlier has to be reconstructed, and that's where the story gets interesting. And the shroud is not alone by any sense of measure. There's countless artifacts that are like this. Christians have long treasured fabrics associated with the Passion, and it's worth a quick tour of those fabrics because the pattern is really instructive. There is the Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain, claimed as the blood-stained face cloth mentioned in the Gospel of John. There are holy tunics of Argenteuil in France and Trier in Germany, two competing traditions, each claiming to be the seamless garment of Jesus, which raises an obvious problem since there was only one garment. I guess there could be two. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not going to get too far into that. There's the Veil of Veronica tradition, and with the image of Mano Pelo in Italy as another claimed miraculous facial image of Jesus. Notice that none of these is another competing burial shroud, though. It should be mentioned also that each of these objects has their own or incomplete contested provenance. So if the shroud existed before the 1350s, where was it? The most developed answer runs through one city, and that is Edessa, in what is today southeastern Turkey. I want to treat Edessa not as one stop on an assumed itinerary as we work our way to the shroud, but as really the central historical problem of the whole proposed earlier chain. This is the true black hole in the center of the shroud story. So we're going to spend some time there. So let me sharpen the question a bit before we start, because it's the sharpest question in this whole episode. So the question is, why does no early source clearly describe Christians in Edessa treating something as the burial cloth of Jesus? The story starts with the name we, who in early church history fanatics know well, Eusebius of Caesarea, the father of church history, writing in the early 300s AD. In his church history, Eusebius tells us a remarkable story about the King Abgar of Edessa, contemporary of Jesus. Abgar was sick. He had heard of Jesus and his healings, so he wrote Jesus a letter, asking him to come to Edessa and heal him. Jesus wrote back. He said he could not come. I mean, for one thing, Edessa was really far from Jerusalem or even the Galilee. But after his ascension, Jesus' ascension, that is, he would send one of his disciples. In time, the disciple Thaddeus, called Adai, in the Syriac tradition, went to Edessa. He healed the king, preached Christianity from there. Eusebius even claims he translated one of the correspondences himself from Syriac documents kept in the royal archives of Edessa. Eusebius lived roughly 3 centuries after the events he described. The archived documents he claims to have used do not survive independently, so we cannot check his homework, so to speak. Most scholars regard the correspondence as legendary. Eusebius's testimony is important. It tells us the Abgar story was established by Eusebius's day, but it does not authenticate the letters. For our purposes today, here is the crucial observation. Notice what Eusebius mentions. He talks about letters, a healing, a missionary disciple, but what he does not mention is important as well. No image, a portrait, or a cloth, or anything like that. About 50-odd years after Eusebius, around the year 380, a Christian pilgrim named Egeria visited Edessa and wrote about her trip. We've done episodes on Egeria, and there are more to come. Egeria was shown the famous letter of Jesus, and she visited the shrine of the Apostle Thomas. She doesn't mention an image. Then, around the year 400, a Syriac text called the Doctrine of Adai retold the Abgar story with a brand new detail. In this version, Abgar's messenger, a court painter named Hanan, painted a portrait of Jesus and carried it home to Edessa. So now, finally, an image enters the story. And notice what kind. A painted portrait made by human hands by a named human artist. Fast forward to 544, the Persians besieged Edessa. And the historian Procopius, writing pretty close to those events, described that siege in detail with no message of any or a mention of any miraculous image defending the city. About 50 years after that, the church historian Evagrius Scholasticus told the story of the same siege, and in his telling, the city was saved with the help of an image of Christ called, quote-unquote, not made by human hands. The image of Edessa, which came to be called the Mandylion, which is really a cool name, became one of the most celebrated objects in the entire Christian world. In 944, the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire wanted it so badly that an imperial army showed up outside of Edessa, which by that point had been under Muslim rule for 3 centuries. The Mandylion was carried to Constantinople in triumph and welcomed with the full imperial ceremony, hymns, processions, the works. The Christians of Constantinople had a great relic, but no mention of a full burial shroud. Now, here is a really interesting theory or proposal, especially associated with the writer Ian Wilson. The proposal is that the Mandylion and the shroud were actually the same object all along. The shroud, folded so that only the face was visible, was then mounted and framed and would look for the whole world like just a facial image. There's even a Greek term in one later text called the tetradiplon, or doubled by 4, that supporters of this theory read as folding instructions hiding in plain sight. The theory is really pretty clear, and it would explain how a full burial shroud could have been displayed and described as just a face for centuries. Here's the deal, though. The earlier sources never describe a full-length burial cloth bearing the image of a body. A mention of folding explains how the shroud might have been displayed, but it does not establish that the 2 objects were, in fact, the same object. A mechanism or a manner for how something could have been hidden is not evidence that it was indeed hidden. On top of that, the theory has to assume that the custodians of Christianity's most precious relic just didn't know or somehow forgot that they actually possessed for centuries this whole entire shroud. That's not impossible. And I could honestly see a circumstance where people, probably priests or bishops, or church administrators of some sort just didn't mess with it because the relic was just so holy. But on the other hand, Christians handle relics constantly. They take them out, they venerate them, have processions with them. That goes all the way back to the Ark of the Covenant. Even an artifact that could kill people if you touched it still got taken out now and again.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
After 944, the proposed chain runs through Constantinople. A French crusader named Robert de Cléry wrote that in 1203 he saw in a church in Constantinople a cloth raised up every Friday in which the figure of the Lord could be seen. After the catastrophic sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusaders in 1204, that object, whatever it was, disappeared from the record. Was Robert describing the shroud? It's a pretty cool sentence from the soldier written a century and a half before Lyrae, with really nothing secure connecting the two ends. And a gap of 150 years sits between the last proposed sighting in the East and the first documentary display in France. And nothing we currently know bridges that gap. And if what Roberts even saw was the shroud at all, so a couple of big ifs there. There's one more major complication in the historical record, and this one concerns art and iconoclasm. The surviving record of early Christian art is thin, and iconoclasm is one of the main reasons for that among several. There are a few exceptions, and they matter for today's episode. Mosaics survive in Rome and Ravenna. Importantly as well, there are some surviving pieces of religious art at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai in Egypt, far outside of the reach of the iconoclast emperors. There survives a Christ Pantocrator icon painted in the 500s. And look up an image of it, or if you're watching on YouTube, there you can see an image of it. It shows the face you already know. Long hair, a particular size and shape of the beard, a solemn frontal gaze, the face that Christian art has given Jesus for 1,500, even longer than that, years. Put the Sinai Pantocrator next to the face of the shroud, and there's a very strong resemblance. Supporters of the shroud's authenticity make an art history claim here. They argue that the Byzantine artists copied facial features from the shroud or the Mandylion, and they point to shared features between the shroud and the face, and icons like the Pantocrator as being the reason why the shroud looks the way it does. Now, the objection is fairly straightforward. Visual resemblance is very hard to measure objectively, and a bearded frontal Christ with long hair may simply be the convention that artists inherited and repeated the way artists in any tradition repeat an established type. And really, there's three possible ways that these all relate to each other. One, the shroud or the Mandylion influenced Byzantine images of Christ. Two, the shroud image was influenced by Byzantine artistic conventions, which would put its creation after those conventions formed. Three, both drew on kind of the Q source idea, I guess. I'm borrowing here from Mark Goodacre's Third Way here, where they both drew on earlier visual traditions and now survive only in fragments. Here's the frustrating part. To throw on to the pile of complexities, very early on, Jesus was often portrayed in art with no beard at all as a young beardless man. With the artistic record before iconoclasm as thin as it is, the direction of influence just is probably genuinely unprovable. The evidence we would need to settle this argument simply doesn't exist, and will likely never have anything concrete one way or the other. All right, so let's look at the big picture to wrap things up. What can the chain of evidence, or the chain of custody, or the provenance actually establish? The documented physical chain securely reaches medieval France, the 1350s at Liray, and runs essentially unbroken through Chambry to Turin today. The proposed earlier chain through Constantinople and Edessa remains circumstantial or inferential at best. The Edessan tradition itself does not hold still in the sources. It grows from letters, to a painted portrait, to a miraculous face image, to the full burial shroud reading is a modern proposal laid over that sequence. The transfer of 944 shows that the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Christians regarded the Mandylion as an extraordinarily important artifact, but the surviving descriptions present just a facial image, not a full burial cloth. Iconoclasm contributes to the incompleteness of the artistic record, but it cannot serve as evidence for what the missing image could have shown. Artistic similarity can suggest a relationship, but it cannot establish provenance by itself. Scientific investigation can address the material age, composition, and image characteristics, and on age, its strongest results does indeed point medieval, with disputes about sampling, but science cannot fill the documentary gap, and it cannot identify what actual human being is represented on the shroud independently. Lastly, a missing chain does not prove, in fact, deliberate fraud. It prevents confident historical identification. Those are two different things, and confusing them is how both sides of this debate can really overreach. Maybe Orwell, from the opening quote, had it right all along. The deepest mystery of the shroud may not be when the linen was woven or how the image was formed. The deepest mystery may be how an artifact of uncertain origin became one of the most powerful sacred images in all of Christianity. And that is powerful stuff right there. I'll leave us with a question to ponder, and I'd love to hear what you think. What does the shroud mean to you? I can see the power of the shroud. Real or forgery is something or something in between from a few different points of view. It's really too big of a topic for me to think about all by myself. So let's talk about it together. To join the conversation or leave a comment, go over to Patreon, YouTube, Spotify, Facebook, or send me a good old-fashioned email. Thank you, Judy, again for this wonderful suggestion, and thank you, everybody, for listening. With that, there is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.